The flight was said to be a quiet one. A few hours of peace after Naomi's intense business trip. She was a woman who preferred to keep to herself, blending into the background, enjoying the solitude that the sky often provided. As she walked through the aisle to her first-class seat, no one took much notice of her. She was just another traveler in a sea of faces, dressed modestly, and walking with a quiet confidence. But not everyone was so indifferent. Lauren, the flight attendant, noticed Naomi almost immediately. Something about her caught Lauren's attention, a woman in her 30s. With a serene composure, sitting in first class with nothing to demand, nothing to boast. Lauren's trained eye scanned Naomi's appearance and quickly made an assumption. She had seen countless faces like Naomi's before, ordinary, inconspicuous people who, in her mind, didn't belong in first class. As Naomi settled into her seat, Lauren approached her with a smile that felt forced. "Excuse me, ma'am," she began, her voice sharp but polite. "I believe you may have gotten confused. This seat is reserved for first-class passengers. Could I see your ticket?" Naomi looked up calmly, her expression unreadable. "I'm sure this is my seat," she replied softly, showing no signs of frustration. She didn't even glance at her ticket, she simply trusted that it was where she belonged. Lauren didn't budge. She took Naomi's ticket and glanced at it quickly. Then back at Naomi. I see. This seems to be a mistake. This seat is meant for a different passenger. Perhaps you'd prefer to move to the back?" Naomi's expression didn't change. She had already been through this before, people making assumptions based on appearances. But today, she wasn't going to let it slide. She replied, her voice calm and even. "I'm comfortable here. This is my seat." Lauren's smile faltered. There was something in Naomi's tone that made her pause. But she quickly shook it off. "Well, ma'am, I'll need to check with the captain to confirm. Please stay here while I double-check." As Lauren walked away, Naomi leaned back in her seat, her eyes closing for a moment. The turbulence in the air had already started. But Naomi knew the storm wasn't just in the skies. Lauren's steps were quick as she made her way to the front of the plane. Naomi could feel the subtle shift in the air as Lauren spoke with the captain. The hum of the engines, the whispers of the other passengers, it all felt distant now. Naomi was aware of the stares and curious glances, but she chose not to react. Her calm was a weapon. When Lauren finally returned, there was a slight hesitation in her step, as if she wasn't quite sure of what to say. But when she reached Naomi's seat, she had a smile plastered on her face. One that was anything but genuine. "Well, ma'am, it seems there was a mistake. The seat is indeed for you," she said, her tone dismissive as if Naomi had somehow caused the confusion. Naomi didn't say anything, simply nodding in acknowledgement. She could feel the tension still hanging in the air, thick and palpable. Lauren wasn't done, though. She leaned in just a little too close, her voice lowered to a near whisper. "You do realize that people like you don't usually travel in first class, don't you?" Naomi's eyes didn't waver, her expression still serene. "People like me?" she repeated quietly, her voice cool. "And what exactly does that mean?" Lauren laughed softly, a bitter edge to it. "You know, people who don't exactly look the part. It's just a little surprising. That's all." Naomi's gaze never left Lauren's face. "I don't think my appearance is anyone's concern," she said softly, but the words carried a quiet authority that stopped Lauren in her tracks. Lauren shifted uncomfortably but recovered quickly. "Well, I suppose I'll leave you to it," she said with a tight smile, walking away but glancing back over her shoulder as if Naomi might vanish. Naomi settled back into her seat, the hum of the plane now a soft, constant background as she gazed out the window. The view of the clouds seemed to offer a sense of tranquility, a stark contrast to the lingering tension in the cabin. She tried to shake off the encounter with Lauren, but her mind kept returning to it. The flight attendant's tone had been off, too dismissive. Naomi knew that feeling all too well. A few minutes passed when Lauren approached with the cart, her movements mechanical, almost as if she were doing a chore she didn't care for. Naomi's eyes flicked over to her, noticing the way Lauren's lips curled slightly as she made her way down the aisle. Her usual bright smile was gone, replaced by a tight, forced one. Naomi couldn't help but wonder if it had something to do with the earlier exchange. When Lauren reached Naomi's row, she paused, barely making eye contact. "Can I get you anything?" she asked, her voice stiff and clinical. Naomi smiled politely, but her tone was measured. "I'd like a glass of water. Please." Lauren's hand hovered for a second over the tray. But Naomi caught a brief flash of hesitation in her eyes. Without a word, Lauren grabbed a glass and filled it. But her motions were sharp, as if she were handling the task reluctantly. As she handed the glass to Naomi, her fingers brushed Naomi's hand, and Naomi couldn't help but notice the coldness in her touch. Lauren didn't apologize, nor did she show any indication of acknowledgement. Just a mechanical gesture before she moved on. Naomi, unfazed, took the glass with a quiet thanks. But her mind was still processing the interaction. It wasn't just about the drink. It was the attitude, the dismissive air that Lauren had carried with her since the beginning. Naomi wasn't just another passenger to her, she was an inconvenience. Something to be tolerated, not respected. The thought didn't sit well with Naomi. But Naomi wasn't one to react hastily. Instead, she let the moment pass, sipping her water and turning her attention back to the world outside. However, the unease didn't leave her. She knew there was more to this than a simple service misstep. As the flight continued, Lauren made her rounds, serving the other passengers. Naomi observed her closely, noticing how differently Lauren interacted with the others. There was a distinct warmth in her voice when she addressed a couple a few rows ahead. An almost overly friendly demeanor when handing out pillows to the elderly woman seated across the aisle. But when it came to Naomi, always curt, always rushed, as though she were going out of her way to avoid any form of civility. Naomi's patience, though strong, was starting to wear thin. She had tried to let it slide, to maintain her composure, but now she began to question if this was just poor service, or something more personal. Finally, as Lauren approached again with the snack cart, Naomi decided to address it, her tone calm but firm, the air around her thick with the subtle force of a leader who had no intention of being ignored. "Lauren," Naomi said, her voice low but clear, "I noticed something in the way you've been serving me. You've been rather distant. If I've done something to upset you, I'd appreciate it if you could tell me directly." Lauren froze for a moment, her eyes briefly flicking to Naomi's. Before she recovered her composure, she gave Naomi a tight, almost apologetic smile, but there was an edge to her voice when she spoke. "I'm just doing my job, ma'am, nothing personal," she said, trying to brush it off as a simple misunderstanding. But Naomi wasn't buying it. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes meeting Lauren's, unblinking. "I understand that, but it's not just about doing your job. It's about how you treat people while you're doing it. And right now, it feels like I'm being treated differently from everyone else on this flight." Lauren opened her mouth, then closed it again, clearly unsure of how to respond. Naomi's calm, steady gaze was impossible to ignore now, and she could feel the weight of the words hanging in the air. There was no arguing with Naomi's logic, no way to deflect the clear accusation. "I don't want to make a scene," Naomi continued, her voice still measured, but now with a hint of the authority that had been absent before. "But I do want to make it clear that if there's an issue, I'd rather we address it directly." The tension between them seemed to crackle in the air, the quiet hum of the plane now amplifying every second of silence. Lauren's smile wavered, and for the first time, Naomi saw a flicker of something. Was it guilt in her eyes? But before Lauren could say anything, she turned on her heel, muttering something about checking on another passenger, and quickly moved away. Naomi sat back, her expression still composed, but her thoughts were racing. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. There was something deeper going on here, something she couldn't ignore. As the flight went on, Naomi couldn't help but feel a shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't just about the service anymore, it was about respect. And Naomi wasn't about to let anyone, especially someone in a position of power, treat her as anything less than deserving of that respect. The plane continued to cruise steadily, the hum of the engines providing a constant backdrop to the tense silence that had enveloped Naomi. She leaned back in her seat, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the window as the city below became a distant blur. Despite the unease that had settled in her chest, Naomi remained calm, her mind turning over the events of the last few moments. It wasn't just the way Lauren had treated her, it was the assumption, the prejudice. The flight attendant's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. Naomi knew that the root of it all lay deeper than just one interaction. It was a systemic issue. one that perpetuated stereotypes and prejudices, not just in the aviation industry, but in society at large. As Naomi reflected on the situation, her phone buzzed softly in her pocket. She took a moment before retrieving it. Glancing at the screen, the message was from her assistant. "Everything is set for the meeting in 30 minutes. Do you need anything before we land?" Naomi paused. Reading the message again, she smiled faintly, touched by the professionalism of her team. Her assistant's calm, respectful tone contrasted sharply with Lauren's earlier attitude. Naomi typed a quick reply. "No. Thank you. I'll be fine." But then, something caught her eye. Lauren, once again, was making her way down the aisle, her eyes scanning the cabin nervously. Naomi took a deep breath and stood up, moving gracefully toward the front of the plane, her heels clicking softly against the floor. The flight attendant was looking at her now, clearly trying to avoid making eye contact. But Naomi wasn't going to let it slide any longer. As she reached Lauren, Naomi stopped. Their eyes met. "Lauren," Naomi said quietly, her voice measured but firm. "I'd like to talk." Lauren swallowed hard, her hands gripping the cart tightly as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. I don't have time right now. Miss Williams." Naomi's gaze didn't waver. "We'll make time." Lauren took a deep breath, her patience wearing thin. She couldn't stand the calm demeanor of Naomi, who was clearly unshaken by her earlier antics. With a forced smile, Lauren moved closer to Naomi, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Really, Miss Williams?" she said, her voice deliberately loud enough for a few nearby passengers to overhear. "Is this your idea of making things right? A public spectacle? If you think you can intimidate me, you're sorely mistaken." Naomi didn't flinch. She maintained her composed stance, eyes locked on Lauren. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the plane's engines, the rest of the cabin seemingly frozen in anticipation. Naomi knew this was the tipping point. Lauren had taken one step too far. "Intimidate you?" Naomi's voice was soft, but it carried a weight that made the air feel heavier. "No, Lauren, what I'm doing is making you realize the consequences of your actions. And this little performance of yours, for all the passengers to see, is just the beginning." Lauren scoffed, folding her arms defiantly across her chest. "Oh, please," she said, "this is nothing. You can stand there all day trying to play the righteous boss. But we both know it's just an act." The sharpness in Lauren's tone cut through the air, but Naomi's response was measured, her eyes unwavering. She took a deliberate step forward, closing the distance between them. "Let's be clear, Lauren," Naomi said, her words carrying the authority of someone who had nothing to prove but everything to uphold. "This isn't about playing anything. It's about respect, something that you've shown very little of, not just to me, but to everyone on this flight." For a moment, Lauren hesitated. The confidence she had tried so hard to project began to crack. And Naomi could see the subtle shift. But it wasn't enough. Lauren wasn't backing down. "Respect?" Lauren spat. "You're still hung up on this? Fine, I'll respect you when you learn how to treat people with real class. Not just throw your weight around because you own a company." Naomi's gaze darkened, but her voice remained composed. "Respect is not something you demand, Lauren. It's something you earn, and based on your behavior, you're nowhere near it." Lauren's face flushed with anger. She took a step forward, but Naomi held her ground. The tension in the cabin was palpable, passengers holding their breath as they watched the exchange unfold. "One last chance, Lauren," Naomi said, her voice low but firm. "Change your attitude, now, or face the consequences." Lauren's eyes flicked over Naomi, and for a brief moment, a sneer tugged at the corner of her mouth. She didn't know who this woman was, but she immediately assumed she was just another rich passenger who had no idea how to behave in a luxury setting. Naomi was dressed in a simple, casual outfit, an unassuming beige blouse, black slacks, and a pair of plain flats. There was nothing about her appearance that screamed wealth or power, and that was exactly what Lauren expected from someone who wasn't one of them. In Lauren's mind, people like Naomi were the kind of passengers who were entitled, rude, and out of place in the first-class cabin. She had been a flight attendant for years, and she knew the type, the rich ones who thought they could buy respect with their designer bags and flashy jewelry. This woman, however, was different. She didn't look the part. And then, there was the subtle shade of Naomi's skin, a detail that didn't go unnoticed by Lauren. though it was never explicitly acknowledged. It was just something that lingered in the back of her mind, feeding her assumption that Naomi didn't belong here. In a world of wealth and privilege. You think you can just sit here, don't you? Lauren said, her voice sharp, though she was careful not to let it show too overtly. First class isn't for people like you. You're not even dressed properly. Naomi's calm smile barely flickered, but there was something in her eyes that didn't falter, an awareness that Lauren had misjudged her completely. Naomi knew what was happening. She could feel the subtle racism, the disdain wrapped in thinly veiled politeness. It was clear Lauren was judging her not just by her appearance, but by assumptions about her background and her place in this world. Lauren's next words were laced with more venom. And I don't know who you think you're fooling, but if you're going to sit up here, you'd better act like you belong. Don't think I haven't seen people like you before. Just because you've managed to scrape your way into a seat up here doesn't mean you deserve it. The underlying insult hit Naomi's chest like a slap, but she refused to let her composure break. She'd heard it all before, from less subtle people, but this was different. The hidden bias was palpable. I belong here, Lauren, Naomi said quietly, her voice filled with quiet authority. And I won't let anyone make me feel like I don't. Lauren scoffed, crossing her arms and stepping back. But Naomi could see the crack in her armor. Lauren still didn't know who she was. And Naomi wasn't going to correct her, not yet. She wanted to see just how far Lauren would take this. The tension in the cabin had become more pronounced. Naomi, still composed, could feel the hostility in Lauren's gaze. She knew it wasn't just the seat or the food, this was deeper. Lauren, like many others, had judged her based on her outward appearance. Naomi's simple dress, unpretentious demeanor, and calm nature didn't fit into Lauren's world of entitlement. To Lauren, someone who didn't look like her and didn't act like her must be beneath her. As the flight continued, Naomi sensed Lauren's continued hostility. When the meal service began, Lauren approached Naomi's seat again. This time, her attitude was even more condescending, her words sharper. Are you sure you're okay? Lauren asked, her tone dripping with insincerity. I asked if you needed anything earlier and you didn't seem to enjoy your meal. Maybe I can bring you something else? You know, some people would love to sit in a seat like that. Naomi took a moment, looking directly at Lauren, her expression steady but pointed. It wasn't about the meal, it wasn't even about the seat anymore. It was about something much more insidious, the way Lauren felt entitled to judge Naomi. To dismiss her based on what she thought Naomi was. I'm fine, Naomi replied simply, her voice calm but firm. And yes, I'm very grateful for the seat. But I'd appreciate it if you didn't question my comfort again. I'm perfectly capable of managing my own needs. Lauren's expression faltered for a moment. She hadn't expected Naomi to respond like this, not with such poise. She wasn't used to people not being intimidated by her. But Naomi wasn't intimidated. Lauren bit her lip, her eyes flashing with irritation. But Naomi wasn't finished. I'm not sure why you feel the need to keep making comments. But I'll remind you, I'm a paying passenger just like everyone else. I've asked for nothing extra. And I expect to be treated with the same respect as anyone else on this flight. There was a brief, charged silence between them. Naomi's gaze never wavered. She wasn't looking for an argument, she wasn't looking to win a fight. She was simply laying down a boundary. Lauren stood there for a moment, clearly trying to figure out how to respond. Finally, she took a step back, her lips pressed tightly together. Fine, Lauren muttered, barely above a whisper, before walking away in silence. Her posture rigid. Naomi watched her leave, but didn't feel any sense of victory. It wasn't about winning, it was about ensuring that her boundaries were respected, that she was treated fairly, like any other passenger. Naomi leaned back in her seat, staring out the window. She wasn't angry anymore, she wasn't upset. In fact, she felt a sense of peace, a quiet realization that sometimes standing firm and remaining composed in the face of disrespect could speak louder than any confrontation. The flight had been quiet for a while, but the tension between Naomi and Lauren was still palpable. Naomi had hoped things might calm down, but it was clear now that Lauren had no intention of letting things go. The next round of service came, and Naomi's instincts told her something wasn't right. As Lauren made her way down the aisle with a cart full of food and drinks, Naomi watched her closely. Lauren, her eyes narrowed, glanced over at Naomi with a look that seemed deliberate. She veered slightly off course as she approached Naomi's seat, slowing down just enough to make Naomi's suspicions rise. Then, in a moment that felt almost choreographed, Lauren made a sharp turn, her arm brushing against Naomi's tray table. Without warning, a glass of red wine and a small plate of pasta crashed down, spilling directly onto Naomi's lap. The passengers around them gasped in unison, eyes widening as the mess spread across Naomi's outfit. For a moment, there was complete silence. Everyone could feel the tension, but no one dared to speak up. Lauren stood frozen, her face an odd mixture of surprise and feigned concern. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said, though there was no real sincerity in her voice. She made no move to help Naomi, her hands still gripping the cart as if she hadn't just caused a scene. Naomi sat motionless for a beat, her expression unchanging. Her clothes were now ruined, but her calm demeanor only seemed to magnify the situation. She slowly wiped a drop of wine from her chin, her eyes never leaving Lauren's. "Accidents happen," Naomi said, her voice steady but tinged with an unmistakable edge. "But I'm sure we both know that wasn't one." Lauren stiffened at the words, her eyes flicking nervously to the passengers watching. Naomi, however, didn't give her a chance to respond. "I'd like to speak with your manager," Naomi continued, her tone now sharp and commanding. "You've been rude, unprofessional, and I believe this incident was intentional. I think it's time we have a conversation about your conduct." Lauren's face drained of color. She opened her mouth to protest, but Naomi cut her off before a word could leave her lips. "I'll be in touch with your superior as soon as we land. And trust me," Naomi said, leaning slightly forward, "you'll want to be on the receiving end of that conversation." For a moment, Lauren stood there, stunned into silence. She glanced at Naomi and then at the passengers who were all observing the situation with rapt attention. No one dared move. Naomi's quiet authority had taken control of the situation in an instant. Naomi stood up gracefully, adjusting her jacket and gathering her things. She turned to face Lauren, her voice low but firm. "You've made your point, Lauren. Now it's my turn." The flight attendant, still visibly shaken, quickly turned away to finish her rounds. Naomi, composed and unruffled, resumed her seat. The cabin was thick with a strange mix of silence and anticipation. No one had expected this. But Naomi knew, sometimes, strength wasn't about confrontation. It was about presence, the power of calm in the face of aggression. The air around them felt thick with tension as Naomi sat back down, her eyes never leaving Lauren. Lauren, still fumbling with the serving cart, had not expected Naomi's calm yet firm reaction. She was now more flustered than ever, her eyes darting nervously around the cabin. Passengers were still watching, some with clear concern, others with a mix of curiosity and awe. Naomi, however, remained composed, her posture straight and her expression unwavering. As the stewardess continued her rounds, Naomi's mind was already calculating the next steps. She didn't need to make a scene. Her goal wasn't to humiliate anyone, but to make sure that this behavior did not go unchallenged. She could see the hesitation in Lauren's movements. This wasn't the first time Lauren had let her attitude show, and it certainly wouldn't be the last if she didn't speak up. Minutes passed, but Naomi's calm didn't waver. She reached for her phone and quickly tapped a few keys. A few seconds later, she sent an email, her first step in addressing this situation formally. Then, as the flight progressed, Naomi watched as Lauren struggled to regain her composure, trying desperately to act as though nothing had happened. But Naomi knew better. As they neared the descent, the captain's voice came over the loudspeaker. The usual announcements about seatbelt signs and safety measures followed, but Naomi's focus remained solely on Lauren. When Lauren came around again, she was visibly avoiding Naomi's gaze, her smile strained and unconvincing. But Naomi wasn't in the mood for small talk or fake apologies anymore. "Lauren," Naomi called, her voice steady but carrying across the cabin. The stewardess froze, clearly startled. She turned slowly to face Naomi, trying to mask the nervousness in her posture. "Could you please come here?" Naomi's tone was polite, but the request was unmistakably an order. Lauren hesitated before walking over, her steps slow and uncertain. When she arrived at Naomi's seat, she stood there, her hands clasped in front of her. Naomi looked up at her, her expression sharp, yet calm. "I hope you've had a chance to reflect on your actions, Lauren," I've already made arrangements for you to meet with your supervisor once we land." Lauren's face went pale. I'm really sorry. Ma'am, I didn't mean for it to happen like that. It was an accident." Naomi's eyes narrowed. "I don't believe that for a second. And I'm sure we'll have plenty of time to discuss it. But you should know this. I don't tolerate disrespect or unprofessionalism. No matter who you think you're dealing with." The words hit Lauren like a slap. Her mind raced, trying to think of a way out. But Naomi's gaze was unwavering, each word cutting through the air with the finality of a declaration. "Now," Naomi continued, her voice smooth, "I expect that when we land, you'll be dealing with the consequences of your actions. And trust me, those consequences will be significant." With that, Naomi turned her attention away, signaling that the conversation was over. Lauren stood there for a moment longer, her face twisted with regret. But she knew there was nothing more she could say. Naomi had made her point. The flight continued its descent, and Naomi felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. She hadn't raised her voice or reacted in anger. She hadn't needed to. Her calm, her confidence, and her ability to assert her boundaries had already been more than enough. The power wasn't in loud confrontations. It was in the quiet certainty of knowing who you were and what you stood for. As the plane touched down smoothly on the runway, Naomi felt a wave of finality wash over her. The ordeal was nearly over. But there was one final step left to take. The moment the seatbelt sign blinked off, she rose from her seat, straightening her blouse and adjusting her jacket. The passengers around her began to gather their belongings. But Naomi remained calm, collected. She wasn't in a rush. She wasn't trying to escape the situation. She waited, and as the last of the passengers began to file out of the cabin, Naomi stood in the aisle, her eyes scanning the crew. When Lauren passed by, Naomi met her gaze with a knowing look, one that said everything without needing words. Lauren's face flushed again, her eyes darting away quickly. But Naomi's presence was undeniable, a silent force that filled the space between them. Lauren knew the gravity of the situation now. She had been careless, yes, but it was the consequences of those actions she was now left to face. Naomi gave it a few more seconds before she called out once again. "Lauren, wait." Lauren froze mid-step. She was on the verge of fleeing the scene. But Naomi's voice was unyielding. "Please," Naomi said, her voice quiet but powerful. "I'm not done with you yet." Lauren turned slowly, her expression now a mixture of anxiety and uncertainty. She stood still, her posture rigid, as Naomi walked toward her. Without hesitation, Naomi took out her phone once more and typed a quick message. She then handed it to Lauren, the screen facing her. "Here, I need you to read this," Naomi said, her tone devoid of emotion. Lauren took the phone, her fingers trembling as she read the short message. It was a brief note to the airline's HR department, clearly stating the issue and the actions Naomi had taken, as well as a recommendation for a full investigation into Lauren's behavior. Lauren's heart sank. She had expected some sort of apology, maybe a bit of relief after the tension. But instead, she was being faced with the weight of her actions. She had no idea who Naomi really was. And now she was going to find out the hard way. Naomi stood still, watching as Lauren processed the information. There was no sympathy in her eyes, only a quiet strength that filled the air. "Now you'll have the chance to explain yourself," Naomi said coolly. "But I'm not leaving it up to you to decide what happens next. You'll be meeting with my team the moment we disembark." Lauren nodded slowly, barely able to speak. The weight of the moment was heavier than any apology she could muster. As Naomi turned to walk away, she couldn't help but notice the murmurs among the remaining passengers. There was no mockery, no laughter, just respect. And with that, she knew, in this small space of a plane, in that brief interaction, she had already made her point clear. As Naomi walked down the aisle, her calm, measured steps echoed through the cabin, every eye on her. The tension in the air was thick, but Naomi remained the picture of composure, like a person who knew exactly how to control the moment. She didn't hurry, she didn't rush to escape. She was fully aware of the power she now held. As she reached the front of the plane, her assistant, Mia, was waiting for her. Naomi's gaze lingered for a moment, making sure that Lauren had been left to deal with the fallout. Naomi didn't need to explain further. Mia had already witnessed the entire interaction. The moment Lauren would face her team was inevitable. Naomi's silence spoke volumes. and it made Mia's admiration for her all the more evident. "Ready?" Naomi asked, her voice calm but purposeful. Mia nodded, eyes wide with respect. "Absolutely." Naomi's focus shifted back to the plane. The crew would be cleaning up. But it was clear that Lauren would not be part of that process for much longer. As Naomi stepped out of the jet bridge and onto the tarmac, the night sky stretched out before her. The cool air felt fresh against her skin. It was a stark contrast to the heated atmosphere she had just left behind on the plane. The world outside was vast and full of possibilities. But before Naomi could take a deep breath, her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from the airline's HR department. She opened it, quickly scanning through the details. The investigation had already begun. Naomi's actions had already set things in motion. The news of Lauren's behavior had already spread through the proper channels. The power she held was undeniable. And Naomi didn't need to look back to know that things were going to change. "Good," Naomi murmured to herself, her tone laced with quiet satisfaction. She had made her point. And now she could let the system do the work. But as she walked toward her car, something made her stop. A couple of the passengers from the flight approached her, their expressions full of gratitude. "Excuse me, Ms." one of them said, his voice warm. "I just wanted to thank you for handling that situation. You were incredible." Naomi gave them a soft smile. "Thank you," she said simply. "It's important to stand up for what's right." They exchanged a few more words before parting ways. But Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Her actions had sparked something. And it wasn't just about standing up for herself or for one flight. It was about the ripple effect. About ensuring that future flights, future interactions, were different, better. As she got into her car and the doors shut behind her, Naomi felt a wave of contentment. She wasn't done yet. There was still more work to be done. More systems to change. But for now, she could rest easy knowing that she had made an impact. The next day, Naomi received the final report from the HR department. After hours of deliberations, interviews, and evidence review, the decision was clear. Lauren's behavior on the flight had crossed several lines: her arrogance, her rudeness, and her deliberate attempts to humiliate a passenger. There was no ambiguity in the matter. What she had done wasn't a mistake. It was a reflection of a pattern of entitlement and prejudice that Naomi could not allow in her company. When Naomi read the report, she didn't feel anger or satisfaction. She just felt a quiet resolve. This wasn't about punishing someone. It was about upholding the values her airline stood for: respect, professionalism, and integrity. Lauren's actions couldn't be ignored. The decision had been made. The next morning, Naomi called Lauren into the office. Lauren walked in with her usual confident step. But her face quickly fell as Naomi's sharp eyes met hers. There was no sign of warmth or empathy in Naomi's gaze, just calm authority. "Lauren," Naomi began, her voice controlled and measured. "I'm sure you're aware of the situation by now. I've reviewed the incident on the flight, and after a thorough investigation, we've made the decision to terminate your employment." Lauren's expression shifted from confusion to panic. Her lips parted, and she took a shaky step forward. Wait, Ms. McCormick, please. I don't understand. I didn't mean to." Naomi raised a hand, signaling for her to stop. Lauren faltered, but Naomi's voice remained even, unmoved. "You humiliated a passenger. Not just any passenger, but someone who deserves the utmost respect. I cannot allow that behavior in my company." Lauren swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously as the reality of her situation started to sink in. I didn't know. I didn't know who she was," she muttered, her voice shaking. I thought she was just another privileged passenger. Someone who..." The words hung in the air. Naomi didn't interrupt, letting Lauren's desperation take over. Lauren was visibly shaken now, the walls of arrogance and entitlement cracking before Naomi's unwavering gaze. I never meant for it to go this far," Lauren continued, her voice trembling. "This job, I've worked so hard for it. I've been through so much to get here. Please, Ms. McCormick, don't do this. I need this job. I've worked for years to get to this position. Please don't take it away from me." Naomi took a breath, watching Lauren with a mixture of pity and resolve. "You should have thought about that before acting the way you did," she replied coldly. "Your behavior wasn't just unprofessional. It was disrespectful. It's about more than just the job. It's about the people you represent." Do you really think someone who acts like that belongs here? Lauren's eyes were wide, pleading. I'm so sorry. Ms. McCormick, I didn't realize. I thought I could get away with it. But I didn't know she was. I didn't know she was the owner. Please, I'm begging you. I've worked too hard. Please don't throw everything away. Naomi's expression softened, but only slightly. Lauren, actions have consequences. You've made your choice. And now you must face the repercussions of your behavior. There was a long pause as Lauren stood frozen, her hands shaking. I can't lose this job. Please. Her voice cracked, desperation clear in her tone. Naomi looked at her for a moment longer, then stood. I'm sorry, Lauren, it's already done. You'll be escorted from the premises immediately. Your access to company property is revoked. Lauren stood frozen, the reality crashing over her in waves. All of her years of hard work, her efforts to climb the ranks, all seemed to crumble in an instant. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but no words came. Her face flushed a deep crimson, and the fear was palpable in the way her body trembled. Naomi stood up from her desk, and with a final glance at Lauren, she gave a single nod. Please escort Ms. Lauren out. Make sure she clears her personal belongings, she said, her voice steady and calm. Lauren wanted to scream, to beg, but all that escaped her were shaky breaths. As she was escorted from Naomi's office, she looked back one last time, but Naomi didn't even glance at her. She had already turned her attention back to the work in front of her. The next few hours were a blur for Lauren. Her belongings were packed, and she was escorted out of the building with little ceremony. A few sympathetic stares from coworkers who had seen it all but said nothing. The finality of it hit her when she stepped outside, the door closing behind her with a quiet thud. She was no longer an employee of the airline. Naomi didn't feel a sense of triumph. She felt nothing at all. Really. She had done what was necessary. She had set a precedent. The company had to be a place where respect was non-negotiable. As for Lauren, her career, like her dignity, had been stripped away in one fateful moment. There would be no second chances. No one would overlook her behavior. Not now. Not ever. Naomi's quiet resolve had made sure of that.